This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, graduate students, and everyone in between, culture workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Chelsea Mikael Frazier, who teaches in the Department of English at Cornell University. Along with scholarly essays and critical pieces, she is completing a manuscript that assembles a Black feminist ecology drawn from Black women's art, activism, and storytelling. She also hosts and directs the educational consultation platform Ask an Amazon. In this conversation, we discuss the place of ecological and environmental questions in the field of Black studies, Black feminist innovations in the field, and the urgent political questions in the study of Black life for the 21st century. Good morning, Chelsea. How are you today?
I'm wonderful. How are you, John?
Not too bad. Third week of the semester starting when we're recording this. For me, I know you're in a different time element as someone on leave, but my days are always better when we have these podcasts. It's a reminder of things that are really important, and I really appreciate you making time for this. I'm really interested to get your voice as part of the series. I think your research is super interesting. Your orientation and background in the field, I know that you'll have a lot to say, and it's really going to be important to get these kinds of voices, people who have training in Black studies on the podcast, not just people who came to Black studies through disciplines. And so all that's to say, welcome to the Black Studies Podcast, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here. I am a huge fan of Black archives of all shapes and sizes. And this one is especially grounding. So thank you so much for having me here.
I appreciate those nice words about the podcast. Also, I like Black archives of all shapes and sizes. I'm going to adopt that phrase. It's a really great one. Everything from the playlist to the Schomburg. So.
It all has its place. Yeah.
So we'll have a chance to talk, of course, about how you imagine the field of Black studies and how your research is situated inside it. But I wanted to start, as we always do, with a more personal question and ask, how did you come to the study of Black life? What got you interested? What drew you to Black studies? And what sustained you in relation to this kind of work?
Yes, thank you for this question. I was reflecting a little bit about it. I don't know if there was ever a time in my educational journey where I wasn't doing Black studies. I just didn't know exactly what it was, or I didn't articulate it in that way to myself. But my mother was a teacher for most of my childhood. But even before she was a teacher, when she enrolled me in a preschool called Seed Academy, which was founded by Eric and Ella Mahmoud in Minneapolis, Minnesota, which is my hometown. And this is a preschool. It was a private preschool that then grew into an elementary school called Harvest Prep. And it was centered around Kemetic and Pan-African principles. And so my mom was just really intentional about making sure that everything about me was affirmed, particularly because Minneapolis has a very insular Black community, but a very strong Black community. And so this was a school where, we're waking up every morning and we're saying the African pledge and we're singing lift every voice and sing, as opposed to alternatives that are aligned with a kind of like anti-Black patriotism, frankly. Mm-hmm. And so, I went to so many different schools because my mom was also the type of teacher where she would she had relationships with teachers all over the city and she knew them, and then she would enroll me in that school to be with them for that grade. So I went to a lot of different schools.
I love that, actually.
Yeah.
As a parent, I kind of like that. I wish I'd been vigilant that way.
I mean, it's completely it's a labor of love that I'm still just I'm so grateful. I continue to be grateful for the work that my mom did and that she continues to do to educate me and keep me again grounded in myself. But one of the biggest things about that kind of education, particularly what I received when I was at Seed Academy when I was quite young, like 3, 4, and then when I was at Harvest Prep when I was like 10, 11 years old, is that, Blackness was normal. Black thought, Black genius was normalized, and Africanness was ideal,
Hmm.
right?
Mhm.
Pan-Africanness was ideal. That was normal. That was my baseline. And then after that, I went to, in high school and middle school and college and grad school, those were all mostly predominantly white institutions, some of them public, most of them private. And so I was sort of equipped with this, I would say, like a healthy suspicion
Mhm.
of anything that seemed to not affirm, who and what I was as a descendant of Africans, as a enthusiast of Black genius, right? Because the broader world does not necessarily affirm that in the West. As a matter of fact, the West is founded on a negation of that. And so in my personal life, there was always dissonance. Like, how come there's all these codes and they don't really make a lot of sense, especially given again this sort of like affective and intellectual foundation of Black genius, Black creativity, and Black thought that I got at Harvest Prep. And so I took all those questions into my educational journey, and I think it was just always there. I was always wondering about my place in the world,
Mhm.
how the broader world worked, and why my place, as Black, as feminine, as young, as intelligent, seemed to cause so many problems.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so I found, I would say, my first intellectual home in women's studies, which is now women's gender and sexuality studies at Barnard College. And I read the autobiography of Angela Davis when I was in a women's studies class, and I was maybe a sophomore.
Mhm.
I was trying to figure out what my major was going to be, and that was the first text that I read um, that really sort of mapped out a possibility of not just, a set of concerns, but also a life. I'm like, oh, she's a scholar. Like, what does that mean? She's traveling around, she's asking these questions, and obviously, Angela Davis's imprisonment is kind of central in that book. But one of the things that stood out to me was just the life that she was leading.
Mhm.
As a Black woman scholar. And so I was like, okay, I think women's studies needs to be my major. So that was, a model and opening for me, and then began to, really focus my study on Black feminism because, quite frankly, again, I remember I was talking to my dad. I was like, "Dad, I think I wanna major in women's studies." And he was like, "What is that, like majoring in shopping?" I
Oh,
was like, "Oh
shoot.
gosh." But
Dad risking all of his credibility with one
literally.
comment.
Exactly. But what it did, he was not the most supportive at that moment, but what it did was it really forced me to it forced me to really think about what was convicting me, and I realized, like, I don't know. I was, 19 years old. I don't know what I want to do with the rest of my life, but I do know that I want to understand the world and, again, understand my place in it. And if I have that as a foundation, I'll be able to do anything,
Mm.
right? And so that's why I chose that field of study. I had a mentor, Rebecca Jordan Young, um, and she was I think she would guided my undergrad thesis at the time, and I just quit basketball, which is I was an athlete for most of my life, and I was feeling a bit untethered. And I'll never forget, she was like, Chelsea, I can't wait until people start paying attention to what's in your head instead of how spectacularly high above the ground it is. I'm very tall, by the way. I'm 6'2". So I remember being like, wow, it's always a mentor or someone who is further along that that, encourages you to walk a different path that you may not have thought about. And so she then wrote me a recommendation after I'd applied for the Mellon Mays undergraduate fellowship program, which has been a part of my intellectual life since I was a junior at Barnard. And from there, went on to start applying to graduate schools. I did my master's in American Studies at Purdue University, which is a program that I adore. And I thought about continuing on and doing my PhD there, but as my questions started to, I think, deepen and become a bit more specific, and it was at Purdue in American Studies where I really learned about eco-criticism.
Hmm.
And the study, which, for those who aren't unfamiliar, which is the study of literature and the environment, it has grown into this broader field that we now understand as the environmental humanities. And I went up to a mentor at Purdue, Dr. Marlo David, and I was like, "Will you do an independent study with me? I want to think about eco-criticism. I want to think about Black women in the environment, and I want to use novels to do it." And she was like, "Yeah, okay, let's do it." I was like, "Great, thanks." So we read a bunch of books that summer. She returned me really to Octavia Butler, Jamaica Kincaid, Zora Neale Hurston, and many others we read that summer. And then I applied to, and now with sort of like a more refined set of questions about what at the time I was thinking really about inclusivity. How come Black women's voices aren't being quote unquote included in environmental discourse, right? I was super convicted by environmental discourse, but I didn't see myself there. I didn't see the texts that I had been, introduced to during my intellectual foundation at Barnard there. I just didn't see it, right?
Mm-hmm.
I didn't see Black feminist, I didn't see the Black feminist intellectual archive reflected in the environmental humanities, especially at that time. And at that time, I mean, now Black ecologies is a thing. Black feminist ecology, is a legible, phrase, right? At the time, I mean, you could not have. This was not the case, right?
Yeah, it really is very recent. Yeah.
It's extremely recent and a bit jarring sometimes to see how the tides can turn. But I didn't see it then. And so I was really interested in thinking through the framework of inclusivity. I then get admitted to Black Studies at Northwestern for my PhD, which at the time was the African American Studies program. Again, now it's Black Studies, which I'm in full alignment with. I consider myself plainly a Black Studies scholar, Black Diaspora Studies scholar. And among many scholars, Black feminist study, African diaspora, a lot of these things. But Black Studies is absolutely, in alignment with my sort of like intellectual overview. And that conversation or that framework of inclusivity kind of fell away as I became more critical of the implications and price of inclusivity, as I started to learn more about conceptually what Blackness is in the modern world, right? What the price of inclusivity into a narrative of modernity is, into a linear progress narrative, right? Which is a lot of things that I picked up from my dissertation chair, Michelle Wright, right? She writes about, against, and critique of sort of like the ways that a linear progress narrative can exclude and harm. And so, so those questions became refined there. And then I was able to, again, there was no one on my committee who was well versed in, or not necessarily they were well versed, but they weren't, their work wasn't centered on environmental humanities, again, because these two fields were not in bed with each other at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So I had a task ahead of me. I really had to, and this was difficult for a long time. I was what most graduate students are doing in many ways is a bit derivative, right? Like you're figuring out what other people have done and figuring out your place alongside that.
Mm-hmm.
In many ways, I wouldn't have articulated it at the time, but I was creating a lane to put myself in. And so that was something that felt really daunting, and I think that's probably why I didn't articulate it that way to myself at the time because I was just trying to survive grad school, right?
Mhm, mhm.
um, but now to be one of those germinal hands in creating Black feminist ecology as a critical field, having people email me and reach out to me during events and talks and keynotes and say, "Hey, I wanted to write about this. I wanted to think about this intersection, and my committee wouldn't let me do it until I showed them your article." I'm like, "Whoa."
Yeah,
The impact has
amazing.
been yeah, the impact has been both humbling, but also, again, that conviction, like, okay, bringing these 2 fields of study together has been really has just started with me trying to see my place, in this set of questions that I felt was the most important for us as humanities scholars. Um, and also think about the fact that Black feminist study had offered me so much, and these 2 fields, which have always been so invested in practicality and the lived and the kind of knowledge that is extrapolated from the lived experiences of Black women, Black femmes, that was worthy of study, important, and that there could and that in bringing these 2 conversations together, we would get things that we couldn't get otherwise, right? So yeah, that's how I came to be here, I suppose.
I love that. Thank you. No, it's interesting in so many ways. I will just say my sister will be happy listening to this. She was also a women's studies major at Barnard, but yeah, now she's a professor of women, gender, and sexuality studies. So I'm sure she'll be happy to
That's
to.
fabulous. Yeah.
I
Oh, I
mean,
love Barnard so much. So, yeah.
she's from a million years ago because she's super old. So, um,
Yeah.
and that's
Well,
not an
it's
insult. I'm
funny, like,
7 years
Barnard
older
makes a
than
lot of
her.
the
So.
same girls, though. So, like, it's or women, I should say, people. So I think that there's definitely a through line. I can always I can, like, spot a Barnard woman for sure.
Oh, all right. I'll try to have her walk by your office at some point and see if you can sense the aura. but it's really interesting also just to hear you talk about not only as a scholar, like as a post PhD scholar, but also as a graduate student, sort of moving into and being a part of forging a new connection, between eco-criticism and Black feminism, Black studies. I have a couple of students who I work with here at University of Maryland who are doing similar things in that, formally similar things of really doing something that no one on the faculty does and having to prove it, but also not having a lot of literature to draw from to sort of prove to us that this is significant. And it's just interesting to see what resources make that possible, because obviously, I mean, it's where you started, for a reason, not just for a reason narratively, but for a reason in terms of a life trajectory. But it's just that unquestioned thing that you said your mother gave you, right? Through schools, through community, that sense of the problem is the world that doesn't understand and doesn't acknowledge, resonate, cherish, whatever the words are, right? And that where are our foundations in those moments where we forge something new? Sometimes it comes mature in a career and you're like, okay, this is my big contribution. But to be a PhD student in a very, that Black Studies program at Northwestern, that's a very prestigious program. And you're like, no, I'm going to do something different. It's a nice testimony to the persistence of origins. And also I think probably that those moments of being set free, at Purdue and Barnard to find your own scholarly ways. So, just remarking on that, because I love it, because it says something about the power of teachers, not only as, I'm going to help you on this path, but also teachers as people who clear space and have that affirmative confidence that,
Yes.
you have this capacity and, the willingness to learn. I mean, Look, no, I swear to God, any English department people at Maryland, I'm not talking about you. But grad professors are not often very good at just letting somebody be something that they themselves aren't, that the professors themselves aren't. And I try to not be that because I think so much is possible when you have a story like you had about, okay, just find your way, right? Make the competence, and then you get to be that. You get to be that supplement for the other grad students. I really love that little plot twist.
Yes, yes, I hope I am. This is a very, guiding people at this level is difficult, right? Being a graduate student is just sort of like an exercise in anxiety. But, and trying to sort of figure out your
Yeah,
own way. It's like another adolescent.
a quote unquote exercise.
An exercise, exactly. And you think sometimes, depending on what program you're in and who your people are, to your point about just like freedom, I had so much freedom. I don't know if there's a situation. I don't even think that I would have chosen this field if I wasn't sort of like always. I had so many mentors who were just like, "Yeah, what do you want to do? Go do it." And I also was the type that didn't want a whole lot of hand holding. I know I needed like affirmation. I needed more of a hug kind of approach, right? Like more, there are some people they're a little bit sharper in their mentorship, and some people really respond to that. I was recovering from a career as an elite athlete, so I didn't need that no more. I needed people who were gonna approach my ideas and me, frankly, with warmth and encouragement and affirmation. Certainly they demanded excellence from me, and I appreciate that. But they also approached their pedagogy and their mentorship with warmth. I can go down the line: Monica Miller, Alexander Wahelier, Sylvester Johnson, John Marquez, Jen Nash, like, my chair, Michelle Wright, like, they're just all incredibly, Huey Copeland, like, they're just all incredibly, they regarded me with so much warmth and so much affirmation. And even though my research, and I think that they were encouraging precisely because my research interests didn't align entirely with theirs. But what they did do was give me tools to go figure out anything, right? Which I think is the most important, because I have found that some people really struggle when they're not under the care of their committees in the same way, because they haven't necessarily practiced being on their own, and that transition is hard.
Yeah,
Even,
yeah.
it's jarring, even if you do have those skills, right? Again, it's like, if it's another adolescence, it's like, okay, now you're an adult. Now what are you gonna do? What are you gonna do? So I really try to model that as much as I can in my own pedagogy, like, to be affirming and let them know, like, I don't care what you do, but make sure that you're able to back it up. Make sure that you're putting the work in. And I'm not gonna hold your hand even though I'm here. So
Yeah, I was raised by LA hippies, and so the affirmative warmth is a thing for me. But then, of course, my mentors in graduate school, I mean, it was at University of Memphis, so it was not elsewhere, but all the faculty were British, and so they were the opposite of that. And I mean, my mentor, I mean, he's not going to listen to this. I doubt he knows how to listen to a podcast, but about a year and a half ago, I was in Montreal at a conference, and we had dinner, and he was like, "You've done well in your career." And I was like, "Oh, the first nice thing you ever said to me." I do not model that. I mean, he's a wonderful person, but we all have different manners. But the warmth and the hug mentorship has always been my way, and I was always sort of yearning for it after a good college career of that. But and I'm really happy to hear you say names. I always like names on the podcast.
Oh, yeah.
Make sure
Again, the
people
archive.
get heard. Yes, exactly. Our lineage is a kind of archive, absolutely. So you did your PhD in Black Studies. So this is, I think, is a particular. Also, I'm glad you're partial to the phrase. Obviously, the name of this podcast, Black Studies. So
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
we renamed my department at Maryland, and the Black Studies contingent lost on the name. I like straightforward Black Studies. None of this anyway. Now we have lots of words in our title, but Black Studies. So I'm interested to hear you talk about how you imagine the field, and this goes so deep into your education, of course. So I'm extra interested to hear how you think about this. What's that portrait for you? And I think about it in relation to its origins, which were, of course, student activists who demanded that there be a place on campus to study the Black intellectual tradition, that disciplines hadn't done this work, and Black studies was going to be and has been that place for study, that place for intellectual life. But of
Mhm.
course, this was happening in the late 1960s when the radicalization of Black liberation struggle had really obliterated so many of those distinctions between a classroom and a community, between study and prescriptive action, between revolutionary politics and campus life. And so, Black studies also has at its origin that demand for a certain kind of liberatory struggle and liberatory politics. And that tension between the political demands of Black studies and the intellectual life of Black studies, I think that tension has really been with the field and still is present. And so sort of in that frame, I'm interested in what for you is the portrait of Black studies that orients your thinking, your work, and your imagination.
Yes, yes. Okay, so how I imagine the field of Black studies has changed because I think when I first came into, like, the Black studies department at Northwestern, I was surrounded by colleagues who were steeped in Black studies as an intellectual field. They had knowledge of names and texts that were central to the field. And I just did not have that background because I was coming from women's studies and I was coming from American studies. So I was very, very well versed in Black feminist study, which is adjacent to Black studies, but is a different intellectual and creative project, right? Um, I think because Black studies is and then okay, Black studies is contested, as we know, right? Down to the name, you sort of brought, like, and again, like, when I started at Northwestern, it was African American studies. That signals it can signal a very US-centric, perspective that is also, rooted in a history of the field kind of being, um, I would say with sociology and history being overrepresented in the field, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And I know a lot of scholars on the podcast have sort of spoken to that. Um, and so I have no disciplinary degrees. So um, I was coming from feminist study. And I think because Black studies wasn't sort of a given to me in my intellectual development at that time, it forced me to always be thinking about like its purpose. Like, what are we doing here? Is this just about Black people doing Black things, as I like to call some factions of people who understand African American studies in a particular way.
Mhm.
And by Black people doing Black things, I mean like, someone studying, I don't know, the entrepreneurship among Black populations or something like that, right? But not necessarily and taking the categories, these sort of like sociological categories to be self-evident, right? Without any sort of like critical disposition, in terms of how we're even establishing how we understand Blackness, how we understand how we categorize people, even maybe how we understand how a study is being carried out. And I think for me that constant questioning of those categories that helps us to understand how Blackness functions and how it has functioned, sort of like within modernity and beyond it, if there is such a thing, is is how I see, kind of like Black studies purpose, right? Um, Now, that said, Black studies I really see Black studies as at this point in time, a very complete or rather well-developed ecosystem. And by that, I mean there's a lot of different elements at play constantly, and they're all reliant on each other.
Hmm, mhm.
Some people, some scholars and some elements of Black studies are builders, problem solvers, right? There's a question, there's a problem that needs to be solved. And there's a scholar who's like, I'm gonna solve that problem, right? And there are people who are building things, right? Who are creating a lot of things. creating institutions, creating opportunities, creating frameworks that lead to more creation. There are also elements and scholars who are forces of destruction and critique. And I don't mean that in a disparaging way. I mean there are people who are, they're taking stuff down, okay?
Mhm.
They're destroying that which needs to be destroyed. They are critiquing that which needs to be dismantled. Some of us are hopeful, some of us are cynical, some of us are, some of us need that sharpness, some of us need those hugs. We all need a lot of different things, and we're all contributing a lot of different things to this ecosystem, right? I think that what connects us all, despite all of this, despite our different disciplinary focus, despite our different methods, despite all these things that make us different from each other, what connects us and what continues to draw me to the field and the work of my colleagues is what binds us together. And that's taking seriously the study of Black thought and the concern for Black life.
Mm.
That's really it for me. It sounds super simple. But in a global society that seeks to erase, to flatten, to cannibalize Black people and culture and thought, nothing could be more important and in many cases risky. So that's how my portrait of Black studies is something that I contribute. I take very seriously, being reflective of my specific strengths, interests, and curiosities, and bringing them in earnest to this field that contains so much and should continue to contain so much in terms of variation and depth.
I love that. And let me just continue with that then and ask you, because you say that, you try to bring, your how you bring your work to the field. And, you've already talked a good amount about your background and sort of orientation in literary and visual culture, eco-criticism, questions of gender and sexuality. And I'm interested to hear you reflect, having said what you said about Black studies. And by the way, I like the it's really just a simple sort of thing, right? I love that. I think we need the sort of what is the one sentence Black studies definition. If I can quote my former late colleague at Amherst College, Jeff Ferguson, rest in peace. He said, "This Black studies, it studies Black people." And I was like, I love you, Jeff. And he says, if you want to be fancy, you can say we study the souls of Black folks. So, but in terms of the, having talked about the tradition, but also about the ecosystem, I mean, that's like my song. I love thinking about things as ecosystems. So when you said that, I was like, yes, we everything's interdependent. We also hopefully consume our own waste and keep it healthy and so forth. But I'm interested how you think these orientations that you have, right, around literature, eco-criticism, and the like, how you think that fits in the history of the field of Black studies, but also what new horizons do you think it's pushing?
Right. I think that, let's see. So I think in terms of my work in relation to Black studies history or past, um, one of the things that I love most about Black studies is the permission that it gave me to reflect deeply on tradition and canon. Some people are very, very critical about the ways that we can sort of like crystallize certain texts and ideas into dogma, right? So I'm leery of that. Weary, whatever that word is. But
Leery and weary. That's a good
leery and
combination.
I'm both leery and weary
I like that.
of this tendency. However, I also respect and appreciate and have benefited, especially as an interdisciplinary scholar, from like, okay, when you enter into when you're an interdisciplinary scholar, you have like, you're always like a little bit anxious because other people in the room you might enter have potentially like a deeper understanding of the way that things are done over here, right? And you're here to come to get the thing that you need in order to take it back to your question. Right. And so it's really, really helpful to be able to consult a canon and consult a tradition in order to ground yourself enough to to leave with the question, and also, of course, to go back to the sort of ecosystem analogy, leave something that's hopefully useful in that room that you enter, right? The room
Yeah.
then being like a particular discipline or a field. Um, and so that being said, I think the way that I see my own work in relationship to the past of Black studies is questioning questioning the ways that environmentalism or environmental thought again has sort of privileged certain kinds of information and text and data, if you will, over others,
Mhm.
right? So, people have asked me a lot, like, "Oh, are you an environmentalist? Are you an environmental justice activist? Are you a scholar? Like, what are you doing here?"
Mhm.
And I say, like, I use Black women's art and literature, and activism as ecological knowledge, right? Like, there is a way that our relationship to our environments is we can study it by thinking about, uh, numbers and thinking about neighborhoods and thinking about air quality and water quality and stuff like that. And those things are incredibly important, which is why I do so much of my thinking and conversation with scholars working in STEM, chief among them, Dr. Fuchsia Hoover, right, of Eco Green Queen. Like, she and I have been talking forever about how my work conceptually and how her work materially talks to each other, right? But that being said, what we if we're we that's one way to study things, but another way is to think about how our relationships with our environments are, of course, rooted and predicated upon our understandings of our culture, right? And so, our most compelling manifestations or products of culture is our art, is our writing, is our speaking, is our listening, and taking seriously Black women's understanding of themselves through that visual, cultural, and literary record is what I hope to leave with Black studies and also in the other disciplines that, I sort of peek my head in the room, get what I need, leave a little bit like, "Hey, don't forget about the imperatives, the warnings, the solutions," that Black feminist studies has always, and this Black feminist creative and intellectual archive has always been doing, leave that there. Okay, I'm out,
I love
Uh,
that.
and so that's how I see kind of like what I'm doing in relationship to this broader field. And I also I see myself in this tradition of Black studies that is um anti-disciplinary because yes, it's in a more simple way. Black studies is about studying Black people. It's also about what can be gleaned from studying Black people. If you start studying Black people, then you have to start thinking about what Blackness is and again how it functions. You know, the circumstances that created this critical category that we call Black.
Mm.
Or Blackness, and then that leads us to the incredible creative work that the field has done and continues to do. Which is what does Blackness then create? What does that category create? What does it create for our knowledge production? What does it create for our sense of self? What does it create for the destruction and or proliferation of Black life or life period, life on this planet? How does it shape our understanding of power? There's all these questions that then start emanating from that from when you start studying Black people, right? And those are the questions that I'm interested in, and I understand that to be part of the mission of Black studies, and and I took it seriously.
Mhm, mhm.
And decided to try to emulate that and perform that in my work as earnestly as I could. So yeah.
Thank you. No, I love that. It's the way those 2 questions about how do you imagine Black studies and how do you think your work in relation to it. I mean, you've been able to produce a really rich sense of Black studies as a field of possibility and not
Yes.
just tradition. And then maybe in some ways, I mean, it's my contention, so I'm saying maybe in some ways this is what John Drabinski thinks, but the tradition is actually possibility. right? The tradition is cultivation and attraction and pulling in, but also I like the way you said, also leaving, right? So when you venture off into the non-Black studies space, actually I'm able to leave something there that can be like an insurgent power for that field as well, right? Something people will resist, but also will occupy some new space. And so, you had already mentioned this, and so just to pick it back up, you said, I've never worked through a discipline, right? Women and gender studies, American studies, African American studies. You are in an English department, which is a sort of a funny conclusion to that. That's, funny in the sense of a discipline in terms of your education. Educational trajectory. Although I've said this on the podcast many times, English departments are more and more like area studies. I really think it's kind of interesting that way. But I'm interested to hear you reflect a little bit on how that trajectory from college through graduate school in non-disciplinary departments and fields, how you think that impacts the way you conceive of a research project, but also how you think about a classroom.
Okay. Yes. Well, so first of all, I should just say, like, I love teaching. And I forget which of my colleagues or mentors said it to me years and years ago, but it's the only thing that we do where there's immediate gratification,
It's really true.
Everything, everything else is like, I had this idea, and then the book came out 15 years later,
Hey,
so
you can't say that out loud, man. You should have a content warning for that. Yeah, anyway.
sorry, everybody. Warning. I'm sorry, but this is the nature of the insanity that we've chosen to devote our lives to. But when teaching, especially if you enjoy teaching, right? Like someone comes in a little bit foggy about an idea, and then you say something or do something, they're like, you know what, I get that now, or I might be interested in that now, and that feels wonderful, right? So in terms of my classroom, I think about this a lot. I think that being again like coming through. So I should also say that ending up in an English department was like, I think some people kind of like fall backwards into a disciplinary department coming from disciplinary degrees. Mine was intentional. Like I did when I was like looking for jobs, I did apply to, a lot of different kinds of programs, but being in an English department was not something that was like that was on my radar, because again, because of my commitment to not just the humanities in general and sort of like English being central to that endeavor in universities still, but also just because of my belief in books. Like I just love books. And so I didn't want to have to explain to anyone or anything why books were important and why novels were important, why poetry was important. And I also had a really wonderful colleague when I was at Purdue, and I was still trying to figure out, like, what my disciplinary kind of home was gonna be, because that is something that we still sort of, like, organize our intellectual lives around, right? Even in interdisciplinary departments, like at Northwestern, you have to pick a track. Mine was expressive arts and culture, and so, but she said, I think I was thinking about different things. I was thinking about history, maybe. I was thinking about social. I was thinking about all these different things, maybe even our history. And she was just like, I think you should do English. And I was like, why? She's like, because you're going to be able to do a lot of different kinds of things if you choose English as your disciplinary kind of home. And I was like, okay, cool. So that resonated and ended up being, very, very fruitful for me. That said, when you're an interdisciplinary scholar, one of the things that I did and one of the things that I encourage my students to do is think about why. Why are you bringing these two disciplines together? Because if you think it's just because it sounds cool and sexy to be an interdisciplinary scholar, let me tell you something. It's maddening. So don't do this if you don't need to. It's not necessary.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
don't need to,
It's a lot of
Uh,
extra work.
it's a lot of extra work to do it well.
Mm.
To do it well, and there's so much. And I think I also I don't want my students and haven't wanted my students to think that there's not like enough in Black women's literature, right? That it has to then be in conversation with something else. Unless, of course, it's necessary for or endemic to the your project or the questions that you're answering, that you're trying to answer, right? And so for me, it felt that way. I was trying to think about all of these different facets of culture that led us to how we understand the relationship between Black femininity and the environment. And every single time for me, I entered into, I would read, I'm reading Octavia Butler and I'm reading her entire catalog. And then I enter at the time that I started at Northwestern, when Geshe Mutu's A Fantastic Journey was at the Block Museum. And my dear colleague, Jared Richardson, was like, let's go over here and just see what this is about. You ever seen the show yet? I'm like, no, I haven't seen it yet. Okay, we going over here. And I go in and I was like, oh, now I understand more about Black femininity projected into the future in a way that I didn't understand. This question I had been bringing to Octavia
Mhm.
Butler, I now have a deeper insight into. I can't exactly articulate why, but being in here helps me understand it more. And that's to me when it really became clear, like I have to take seriously thinking about visual culture and conversation with the literary, right? And similarly, when it comes to how I organize my classroom, I tell them, and I've heard of many other scholars on the podcast mention this before, but it's so true. Like, what's your question? Have fidelity to that, but don't be necessarily committed to any particular disciplinary formation
Mhm.
because that could limit your ability to understand, refine, and then answer your question, right? So I'm trying to think about my question was really, one central question that animated, especially the early work, and really still the current work is what is Black women's relationship to the environment? How can we understand Black femininity as subjecthood in relationship to the environment? And what thinkers help me answer that question? What materials help me answer that question? Um, and that's what I want my students to do as well. Like, what are you interested in? What are you interested in? And then presenting them with materials. With my graduate students, with presenting them often with like interdisciplinary scholars, to read. And with my undergrads, thinking about just giving them new questions to think about, right? Like, and introducing them to new lines of thought, and then encouraging them because some of them, frankly, they're not going to pick up another novel again after they leave college. They're just,
I hate
which
that
is
part. Yeah, it's
I
true.
know, but it's true. It's just true. It just is what it is. But we have to also take that seriously as scholars, Black studies and otherwise, and then think about how we want them to make sense of and use books while we got them in front of our face,
Mm.
right? So a lot of them are gonna go on and you know, uh, lawyers, they're gonna become doctors, they're gonna become, entrepreneurs, they're gonna become whatever. They're gonna become all the things that they become. And I want them to think about how these materials are helping them be whatever they wanna be, you know, and do whatever they wanna do, right? Which is an inherently, I think, interdisciplinary endeavor because it's not then about in this tradition, here's how we do things and these are the book that we use, but instead here is my, interest in life. Here's my maybe professional aspiration or my personal interest. How does this book speak to that? How does this
Mhm.
story of Black life help me make sense of that further? Right. That to me is what is the most important. And that's how I try to approach my pedagogy in my classroom space.
And that really empowers students as readers, that you can read with a purpose, that this book is not here to lecture you. I think the book as a lecture is a model I also try to really press against. And I think just gave testimony to it, but Black studies really does enable that because the sources of Black studies are so varied that, the questions you bring to the sources and that the sources bring to you and that interplay is really where all the thinking happens. And I find like once you ask a student, like get a student to talk about what they're interested in, what they really want to talk about, what they really want to write about, study, they have a whole backstory how they even got there. I mean, it's coming from all kinds of sources, and those sources part of teaching is like that's not the end of the conversation. That you came to this through this music video, this conversation with your aunt, or and then this other sociology class. There are also these other things, but it's like no, those are the sources that shape the question. Now let's think about how to think about those sources, and that multidisciplinary approaches, as you said, it's a lot more work. but it's also just honest about where we come from in so many ways. Like, as we come from all kinds of places when we come to an idea.
Yeah, we do, and then and again, as interdisciplinary scholars, we then have to try to, like, wrangle that
Yeah.
to something discernible so that it can be communicated and disseminated legibly.
Yeah, to use the image of, before we hit record, we were talking about, if academics are, working with academics is kind of herding cats. It's like that's our professional lives, but then our writerly lives has a kind of cat herding to it as well,
Oh my
because, a song, an essay, a novel, a critical theory essay,
god.
these things will wander in different directions. But hopefully that's the pleasure of the study too. So let me ask us one of the last two questions. Thinking first about the history of Black studies, what do you think that the field has done well historically, and what do you think it has not done particularly well?
Mm, okay. Hmm. So, okay, I mentioned that ecosystem earlier, and I think, one of the things that Black studies has done particularly well is take seriously and reflect the huge diversity of Black thought and the different ways that Black life can be studied. Um, and I think it's freeing. It just feels like freedom. I felt that when I was at Northwestern. I didn't feel like I had to do a whole lot of explaining before I told a colleague an idea, or before I shared an idea with a colleague, or you know, or with a professor. I was, you could start with the question and then go further, into the possibility, right? Into the deeper critique or into the deeper creation, like right away. With a lot of other quote unquote traditional fields, it's like people are not well versed in Black life and Black study, Blackness, right? And all of its iterations, African diaspora study, Pan Africanism, Black feminist study, and so on and so forth, right? So you have to do a whole lot of catching up before you then go, okay, now to my point, right? To my point or to my actual question. Um, Black studies is like, oh yeah, no, we're caught up. What you got?
Yeah.
you know. And so I think that um, especially, I mean, I have a lot of affection for my department where I got my PhD because of the ways that things were organized. And again, like so much contention, so much contention in terms of like how we do things. But I think that just the existence of a space that legitimates the wide breadth of how we approach the study of Black life is something that Black studies has done very, very, very well. Um, and sometimes we even, just the idea that this relationship between Blackness and brilliance is self-evident and can be enjoyed and explored just for that sake,
Hmm.
right? Like, there's nothing that it needs to do other than exist and grow for the pleasure of this particular approach or field or body of thought to just grow. I love that about Black studies, so much, and it keeps me interested. I'm an intensely curious person. I always have been curious, and, Black studies just always fuels my curiosity in ways that connect back to my lived experience. Um, so yeah, I think Black studies has done that incredibly well. Uh, okay. Now on to what Black studies has not done particularly well. While I do, uh, believe that, Black genius and the genius of Black life should be studied for the sake of just existing, I also don't know if Black studies has taken seriously enough how students and people outside of the institutions that we often labor in are making practical use of what we do.
Mhm.
I don't think that we think about that enough. And I think that the pandemic really exposed that. Um, in many ways, the pandemic was a terrible time So much loss, so much death, so much disruption. At the same time, it democratized access to knowledge in terms of digital tools and the proliferation of connection and the spread of information and education. And I think that that freaked a lot of people out because
Yeah.
they weren't able to hold on to the elitism that made them feel, frankly, important because of their institutional ties.
Hmm.
And I think that we got to let that go because we know that these institutions, especially right now, you know, to put it democratically, have other obligations that they are prioritizing.
Yeah.
So, where does then that leave us as Black Studies scholars? What is our purpose outside of the institution? I really think that we need to take that question a lot more seriously, and we have to stop scoffing at the tools that we need in order to make our presence, our expertise useful, not just to people outside of ourselves, but even to ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? In many ways, Black feminist ecology is a thing because of, frankly, a lot of work that I did outside of the academy in digital spaces, connecting with people, connecting with folks who were using Instagram and using Twitter and using, all of these different platforms in order to educate. And I had to rely on those things because, again, um, there wasn't a disciplinary formation for thinking about the intersection of Black women or Black feminism and ecology. Even at Northwestern at the time, there wasn't um a scholar who's like, I'm centrally a Black feminist scholar.
Mhm.
Jen was there for a bit, which was great, and then she left. you know. Um but yeah, so all that being said, like I had to supplement a lot, using other kinds of tools, and there are a lot of people who do that, right? Who are doing that work, but I think that there's a lot of turning our noses up at things, that could actually help us, which is part of the reason why I love this podcast so much, because um, we have to take seriously all kinds of our archives, and the different shapes that they take. Um, and we also have to, even as we critique, and the Black Studies is in many ways steeped in kind of like a perpetual critique of the institution. But there's a lot of ways that we give sort of like all our understanding of credibility to the institution. And that in many ways belays the origins of Black studies. And I wouldn't say that I'm like a purist or anything like that at all. But I think that we have to think about, and this is why, if I'm sort of like, do have any fidelity to any field, it's probably Black feminist study and Black feminism in praxis, because Black feminism always has had this very precarious relationship to the academy, and it's always kind of has its toe in and its toe out. And not always because, Black feminist studies scholars want it that way, but it's sort of like the nature of the project of Black feminist study, and also the nature of sort of like the institution in the West. So I want us to really just think about that question a little bit more. If the institution didn't exist, what would you, as a Black studies scholar, be? What would your purpose be? How would you teach? How would you write? How would you think? How would you make intellectual community? Would you? Right? um,
Yeah.
so, yeah, I think that's something we need to bring a little more attention to.
Look, there's been a lot that's been fantastic about this conversation, but that alone, as a takeaway for people, like something to really sit with. I just think it's so important. People have said it in different kinds of ways with different kinds of anchors on the podcast, and every time I'm really struck by how that is a return to the origins of Black studies. It's not
Mhm.
even a new horizon, but it's an old horizon that has become new again. And it's so urgent because, I mean, I hate to be bleak, but I mean, let's be real. I mean, who knows in 3 years if Black studies will exist at most, if any, institutions? I mean,
Yeah. Right.
Indiana's historic. I mean, Indiana University's program is historic, full of really brilliant people, past, present, and would be into the future. Just shut down overnight, and it was, it really struck me, and it's a question I've been sitting with because I'm part of the field, but and I'm in a department, but no one rallied to their side, because everybody's afraid that we'll get shut down, wherever we are. And that goes directly to your question, is part of what motivates that fear of getting shut down. Not just, obviously we want jobs, we think universities are important,
Well,
but is
yeah.
part of that fear that we can't answer that question that you ask, like, what would our study, what would our teaching be without an institution?
Mhm. Mhm.
It's a very intense question. And
It
I'm repeating what you said, but I'm repeating it because I'm really moved by it, and I'm really happy that you put it in the podcast. And maybe that's an answer to the last question I have, but I'll ask it anyway.
okay.
Which is, in the context of Black studies, what's the question you'd want us to all be asking, or the issue you'd want us to all be thinking about?
Well, yeah, so that question that I mentioned before is something that is really on my mind. But I also, I think a very urgent question is, why aren't we talking more about Africa? Like, I think, we talk a lot about diaspora. Um, and there have been some scholars on the pod I know who are African studies scholars who are amenable to being associated with or understood also as Black studies scholars, right? Or else I imagine they wouldn't even have agreed to
Yeah.
be on the pod, right? um, but I think that um, as a uh, as a, field, we don't do a great job of conceptualizing the relationship between, Blackness and the diaspora and Africanness in general, or Africa on the like, we kinda, like, start on we, like, start in the middle of the Atlantic, and it perpetuates a lot of ideas that I find really troubling. Number 1, that, African people slash Black people, like, popped out of these slave ships, like, that there was no and is no access to an ethnicity beyond, Black diasporic formation, that Blackness, Black thought, Black life is a response to anti-Black racism, that Africa is somehow in and African people are somehow in the past, and I don't like it.
Yeah.
Don't like these I don't like these assumptions. I don't like these orientations. Um, it's even something that I sort of, like, go through this, like, moment of tension every time I teach Intro to African American Literature because, we start with, like, Phyllis Wheatley and, I think a couple of the first texts I teach, like, Harriet Jacobs, and there is a story of Blackness in the Americas, right? Um, that does in many ways begin legibly in terms of, like, the literary record with enslavement. Um, and also I should say that there are, programs, and departments, particularly ones that are, aligned with the term and the ethos of Africana that do, challenge these sort of, like, notions that I'm talking about, right? So I'm not saying that this work is not being done, but I do think in sort of the ways that Black studies is, being carried out now, and a lot of the ways that things are being taught, and a lot of the texts and scholars that are deified can sometimes perpetuate in the way that they're engaged, not even always what they're writing, but the way that they're engaged can perpetuate this notion that Black people are not Africans, that we're not in the past, that there is this huge disconnect between, those Black life and thought in the diaspora, and I just want, on an institutional level and on a scholarly level, for us to start thinking critically about why, and some of it is also is a it's a testament to sort of how we're educated in this country, outside of outside of even becoming Black studies scholars, right? So it's not all on Black studies, but I think it's something that we need to take up,
Mm.
a lot more seriously. because of, I think, some of the conceptual and material problems that it creates, you know? Like, I'm tired of the diaspora wars, you know, round 5011. Like, I'm tired, you know, and I think we need better. So that's one question that I want us to, or set of questions that I want us to be asking in earnest a lot more. You know, what's the relationship between Blackness and Africa? Are we thinking as critically about that as we could be?
I love that. I mean, I think, Ashley and I, my collaborator on the podcast, we've been talking about it from the beginning about the
Yeah.
importance of having representation of Africa, and it's not been easy, which is a mirror held to the field, right?
Yes,
As you said.
and the field of African studies too, you know, because it has a long history of sort of coming from this, like, very anti-Black, like, anthropological, like, there's
Yeah, yeah.
it's deep and complex and crazy, but,
But
you know.
I do think the podcast going forward, both Afro-Latino studies and
Mm,
African studies, is going to be a significant part of the podcast for those reasons that you just articulated in terms of Africa. And also this question, I mean, it sits with me. I was asked by Roland Abiodun, who was my colleague at Amherst College for many, many years, where he was asking, why isn't Africa more a part of your teaching, asking me. So I appreciate being put on the spot by him. Because he's a good person, so he was coming critically from a really great place. But he said, the centuries-old trope about Africans is that he's Nigerian, says that
mhm.
we exist outside history.
Exactly,
And so what does it mean if we're repeating this trope in the field of Black studies?
and
That
we are.
outside the history of Black studies, Africa exists outside. And when he put it that way, and I was like, "Oh, you've made Black studies into a Hegel," right? If we don't do this, and it stuck with me. I mean, it's changed some of my teaching and literacy because I tried to be responsive, but also in the end, this is also about hiring. Right. And
Mm,
training and curriculum and all of that. So not to take over your question, but this one sits really heavy with me morally, politically, and also just you talking about curiosity. I mean, there's so many amazing things it's a massive continent with such massive diversity in terms of everything from language to religion to food to literature. So I like that as a place to lead. Like, let's all find our ways through our curiosities back to some engagement with this.
yeah, 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 we need to, and there's, like, so many other things I could say about that, but I know.
Well, I do,
Yeah,
I do think, we want to do some topical podcasts in the future, and I think Black Studies in Africa is going to be one of those topical conversations with multiple people, former, previous guests, and so we'll make sure we get you on so we can have this kind of extended conversation. But, I was really looking forward to this. As I said at the beginning, I think that your interests and your orientation in the field is so important for Black studies. So I had really high expectations and hopes for this, and this has absolutely exceeded all of that. So thank you for your time, but your thoughtfulness and clarity about what we do in Black studies and the kinds of things we ought to be doing and questions asking ourselves is just a really fantastic contribution to the series. So thank you so much, Chelsea.
wow, thank you so much. That's very, very thoughtful. I am flattered that your expectations were high. I'm humbled that I did not disappoint you. And
I didn't say the word disappoint. I said you exceeded my hopes.
exceeded. I'm humbled that I exceeded those expectations. That is, given the breadth of genius that you have had on the pod, I'm, like, just beyond honored, beyond thrilled. Thank you so much to you, to Ashley, to Bree. Like, this is truly, it's been an honor. So I'm delighted, and I can't wait for more. So
All
yeah,
right.
thank you.
Well, thank you again. And yeah, so I will give you back the rest of your sabbatical day.
Yes,
I'm going to go off and do some meetings with students and administrators and so forth. But have a great rest of your day.
you too, John. Bye.
Bye bye.